we've got Layla here. Layla, could you kick off by just introducing yourself to everybody? Just give us a bit of information about who you are as a person.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Um, as Claire says, I'm Layla McCay. I'm a doctor by training, actually. I started out working in the NHS and then I moved into health policy, working at a national level with the government and then internationally with the World Bank and the World Health Organization and a few different NGOs. And right now, I am Director of Policy at the NHS Confederation. So if you turn on your television and see somebody talking about the NHS, sometimes it's me. And beyond that, I run the National Health and Care LGBTQ plus Leaders Network. And I live in London with my wife. And that's about it for me.
Amazing. Amazing. So show us your book, Layla.
I have just written this book, folks. It was published at the end of May. It's very exciting. Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling: How LGBTQ plus people can thrive and succeed at work. You know, you want to own the book. It's amazing. But yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff in it, which is obviously why I'm here to talk to you today.
Amazing. And just explain the background to this for us then. What made you want to write a book about this?
Well, it's funny because it never occurred to me to write a book on this topic at all. I'd only ever written one book, which was a co-authored book about urban design and mental health, which was a topic where I run a little think tank on that topic. But I was having lunch with somebody that I knew, and he had been on an interview panel a while back for a job that I had wanted. And he told me just as a funny anecdote that during that job interview, in the panel discussion afterwards, where they tried to decide who they were going to appoint, somebody said they didn't want to appoint me because I'm a lesbian. And he told me this and he laughed. And I was really shocked. And I was also embarrassed that I was shocked because I think we all know that it is very much the case that LGBTQ plus people experience discrimination during hiring and recruitment processes. But I think it's a different thing to being aware of that as a concept and then actually seeing it happen to yourself. So when that happened, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started second guessing other decisions that had been made in my life and whether actually I hadn't got all these other opportunities, and maybe even in my current role were people making decisions about me based upon me being gay. And I wanted to read a book about it, so I looked for one and I realized that there didn't actually seem to be a useful book on this topic that gave me what I was looking for, which was, what is the experience of other people here? What does the research tell us? What is the impact of being LGBTQ plus when you're climbing the career ladder? So when I couldn't find the book, it then occurred to me that maybe I should write the book. And that is, in fact, what ended up happening.
Amazing story. If anybody would like to share similar stories to that in the chat, then please do, where you've heard about somebody being discriminated against, or you've heard that you've been discriminated against, because it's quite rare that we actually get this insight. I think it's much more likely to happen sort of behind the scenes. Thanks for telling us that, Layla. So tell us about your methodology then for writing this book.
I took two different tacks to get the information to put in this book, and one was research, as you can imagine, a bit of desk research. So I looked for all the research studies that were available. I was actually quite disappointed. The research studies there weren't that many of them. They weren't of amazing quality. But what there was quite a lot of interesting surveys and research that had been done by employers or by organizations related to employment, and things like even the survey that you just mentioned, Claire. The people doing surveys asking people, what is your experience? Some really, really big ones. There's a brilliant one across the whole of Europe, like around about 100,000 people, asking them these questions about their experiences in the workplace. So bringing all of that together, I was able to get a really interesting view of what is currently known and what's currently being discussed, the big areas and some of the recommendations. And then I realized I wanted to I wanted to complement that. So what I did was interview about 40 very senior LGBTQ plus people who are working at high levels in different sectors and in different countries. I think in the end, I ended up getting people who were living in about 17 different countries and in all sorts of different sectors. So, for example, CEOs of digital companies, chemical companies, VPs, presidents, directors, ambassadors, even a couple of celebrity chefs. It was quite a range of people that I ended up interviewing, and I just asked them about their experiences, which was really interesting because when I started my career, I was actually a psychiatrist, so I was putting my interview skills to good use and asked them all sorts of questions, brought them together into themes, combined that with the desk research, and produced the book.
Amazing. Amazing. So what did you find out then? What are these barriers to career growth that were really sticking out in your research?
And it's interesting because when I asked people, they immediately said, "Oh, I don't think there are any barriers. What are you talking about?" But then the more we talked about it, they were thinking of all these different things, and there's all sorts of interesting barriers that people identified. So let me just share a couple of them with you. One of them is obviously the impact of growing up as an LGBTQ plus person. Not everybody knows that is the situation when they are that age. But if you do grow up queer, it can be a tricky business because we realize that we're immersed in some kind of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, whatever it might be. And it comes from the media. It comes from, what we watch, what we hear and see, but we also hear it from people that we really respect and love, like school people, family, friends. And it creates a sense of negativity about yourself that can really have an impact on your lifelong career trajectory because you can feel a bit isolated, a bit different, a bit separated from the usual rituals of adolescence. It keeps you away, I guess, from some of those normal experiences that other people would just have as a matter of course. And that can have all sorts of impacts. So, for example, it affects our self-confidence, our aspirations, our self-belief, our trust that we do have a support network because we know that there's the possibility that we could be rejected. And some of us become unusually strategic and self-sufficient and quite bad at asking for help in that context. Some people who've had these bad experiences of rejection or fear of them, that's something that can quite often come back in the workplace where we react to things in a particular way. I mean, as you can imagine, there's a giant childhood chapter in the book, but and there's all sorts of interesting impacts that these things can have. But it won't surprise you that another one of those impacts is coming out at work.
Mm.
Because, we all know that when you come out at work, it can have various negative effects in terms of discrimination or bullying or harassment. I mean, many staff surveys will tell us that we are more likely to experience that. But not being out can also be really bad for our mental well-being and also for our work performance. In terms of it being such a big mental burden that just sucks up your energy, maintaining a facade, avoiding questions about what you did at the weekend, making up something vague that makes you seem standoffish to your colleagues. I mean, many of you will be familiar with these things that happen. But just generally feeling all that guilt and stress and anxiety that somebody's going to find out and judge you or use the information in a way that is bad for you. And that is just so much wasted energy. When I spoke to so many people, they just referred to how once they had come out, they really felt that they were just so much better able to do really well in their job. They had more job satisfaction. So I think that the coming out question is a complicated one. And obviously it's not a one-off situation. You've got to consider that whenever you have a new job, whenever you have, you move offices, all sorts of things. So lots of interesting impact there. And then obviously I mentioned bullying, harassment and discrimination, which is generally higher than for the general working population. But quite often what's not reported is the more subtle discrimination, like managers who judge LGBTQ plus staff a bit more negatively or give us professional development advice that essentially amounts to something like, could you just be a bit less gay? Um, and I think that all of that can affect our opportunities and how we think about ourselves. And what else? At the beginning, I mentioned hiring, recruitment procedures, but it obviously I gave you an example of sort of quite overt discrimination from somebody involved in the hiring process. But actually, quite a lot of where we lose out is because we self-censor ourselves. So, for example, we might think that we're not good enough for a certain opportunity for these reasons that I just described, or most of us have not had the opportunity to have that many senior visible role models in our workplaces. So that affects what we think that we should be able to achieve ourselves, even if we don't really think it does. It has that subconscious effect.
In the survey results that are coming through at the moment, one person said they were in a job interview and somebody said to them, we wouldn't hire a puff.
I mean,
literally in the job interview. So that's an overt discrimination, but also what's coming through is exactly what you've just said, self-censoring. I wouldn't want to go for that because I wouldn't want to be putting myself forward so other people would look at me more.
Well, exactly. And then I think that putting yourself forward is particularly interesting when it comes to those more senior jobs and leading organizations, because actually you're not just having to be potentially out to your colleagues. You're out in quite a public way, and people might choose to have views about that. And sometimes even there's the consideration of your partner or your spouse or whoever who may not actually want to be out in that public way, but there's the risk that they're going to be thrust into the public eye. So there's that consideration as well.
Layla, tell us more about the role models. Why do you think role models are important?
They're so important because being able to see somebody like you achieving good things makes you believe that you can achieve good things. And I spoke to so many people in the book, and they were like, when I was young, I would look around and see who was gay like me, and there would be my mum's hairdresser, and there would be maybe like some pop singer. So I'm like, are my options in my career to be a hairdresser or a pop singer? And I think that was from somebody who works in YouTube now. And he was reflecting that this had such this impact in his life that he really had to understand that there were more opportunities that a gay person could succeed in. And I think that is a trend that I really heard throughout the interviews, particularly that people, when they couldn't see other people, their self-confidence was knocked. And that was one of the reasons, of course, that Steve Jobs came out. Steve Jobs. What am I saying? Yeah, that was one of the reasons that the CEO of Apple came out. And I'm saying Steve Jobs, but
it's his colleague, wasn't it? What's his name?
sorry, Steve and Tim. Yeah, so when Tim Cook came out in 2014, and he was the first CEO of a big publicly recognized company to do that, and it had such a big impact, and people asked him, why did you decide to do that? Because obviously it was a big deal, like even in 2014. Like it's weird, isn't it, to think of how recently this was such a huge deal. And it's still a bit of a deal, but in those days, like he was the pioneer. And people said, why did you do it? And he said it was for that reason. It was because he was in a position of sufficient privilege. He was the CEO of this company, and people needed someone to look up to and believe that they could aspire to do that, who were LGBTQ plus as well. And I think that the research just tells us really definitively that having people you can look up to and think, that person's a bit like me, and thus I could achieve something like that, is one of the most impactful things. But it's not just, the distant people who are your role models who are like, oh, they're somebody who runs Apple. I think that there's a huge amount of evidence that also tells us that even if you are an LGBTQ plus person in your work and you're able to be that role model, then it's one of the most impactful things that any of us can do as LGBTQ plus people. Obviously, some people can't do it for all sorts of reasons, but if you are able to be out and public about that, then the impact that that has is really, really far reaching. One of the other people I interviewed, of the 500 top companies in the US, only currently 3 of them are run by LGBTQ plus people. And I interviewed one of them for the book, Jim Fitterling from Dow. And he told me how he came out on National Coming Out Day on a big webinar to his entire company, more than 50,000 people at once, crikey, which was very, very bold. And he said that ever since then, he gets all these letters and comments from people who worked there at that time, who remember that day, and their families, and people saying, you know, you made us think differently about what we could achieve, about what our kids could achieve. It changed our view of what it means to be an LGBTQ plus person. And
Yeah.
I think that all of us who are working in any organization have the opportunity to do that for someone. And it's a big opportunity that we shouldn't underestimate.
I think that's one of the reasons that Matt and I set up Pride in Leadership. We felt that there weren't those role models out there. There wasn't somebody that you could look at and say, that person is like me and they've been successful. You know, I could have a successful career. I think we were taught as young people that it was less good to be gay or to be LGBT, I should say, than to be straight. And so that hits somewhere, it lands somewhere inside you, doesn't it? And it can affect you. But if you can prove that that's wrong, if we can prove that through having good role models, then that would be a good thing. We've had a question from Melissa Harrison Crowley. Melissa has asked, in your research, did you see differences in sector around individuals' ability to be out at work, e.g. banking, finance versus media?
Yes, but I would say that there's not really solid research that I was able to find on that. I mean, I suppose something might have been published in the last year since I finished the book, but there wasn't brilliant research. But what there was a lot of story and anecdote. And in terms of the story and anecdote, which you can take as you see fit, many people speculated that sectors that were quite public facing tended to be better for being able to be out and be your authentic self, because they had a closer understanding that the world is a very diverse place, and they wanted that reflected within their organizations. So, for example, banking is a good example of somewhere that people felt was more amenable than you might expect. Consulting was quite a big one. Various customer facing things, whereas I mean, I was not actually able to get anybody from the oil and gas sector, which many people reflected on as being a particularly challenging place, although obviously there will be exceptions to that. And yeah, and again, transport in general, many people reflected that was a real challenge. But also it sort of depends on what sort of job you have within those organizations, in terms of people who worked in a team found it slightly harder than people whose job was a bit more autonomous as well. So I think there's lots of different things that impact that challenge, and of course all sorts of other things, like where are you in the world, what part of your career are you at. As you become more senior, it's simultaneously harder and easier to come out.
We've got a question from Rachel. Rachel, you're on camera at the moment. Would you be happy to come off mute and ask the question yourself? You said some places have senior role models who might be good gays, but not necessarily achieving good things. Could you just explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think I was just being a little bit cheeky. In that where I work, it's quite a diverse, you know, equality and diversity is quite well promoted, and we've got some very senior queer people, but they might not always be viewed as good role models. So it's kind of good and bad in a way.
Yeah, I suppose that is the trade-off, isn't it, with role models? In the research that we've been doing, and it's early days yet because we've only had 270 responses, but one of the comments that came through was, I had a really good role model. He was great for my career because he told me not to come out and he taught me how to hide it for years. And so it's kind of, you get a great, oh, good, a good role model. Oh, I'm not sure that that's kind of how I would go about role modeling. What do you think, Layla?
I mean, it's a complicated question, isn't it? I think that LGBTQ plus people, just like anybody else, can be great or not so great. And I think that as we're moving just slightly more into the inclusive space in this world, as opposed to this one CEO that's publicly out, there is that space for people to be good and bad and everything in between in all their diversity. And there's this sort of feel that as an LGBTQ plus person, if you want to succeed, you have to be a good gay, you have to be better than other people, you have to be, morally squeaky clean, you have to somehow be like this perfect version of yourself in order to be able to advance in the way that other people haven't. So in some ways, hearing about LGBTQ plus people who maybe aren't that great, but are still managing to succeed, we could put a positive spin on that, couldn't we? But in terms of choosing your role models, it was the case that you could at one point only look at the one existing person and that had to be your role model. But now we have the opportunity. There's more than one role model to select, and hopefully people can use some critical thinking and think, actually, being an LGBTQ plus person is not the only thing I'm looking for in a role model. That said, even though this person may not be a role model in how I want to act or behave, there's still a certain benefit to come from seeing that somebody can be openly LGBTQ plus and can be nevertheless succeeding in the world. So I think that we all need to be a bit critical, don't we, of who we're inspired by and who we aspire to be a bit like, and why that is. And perhaps it's not one person to deliver the whole thing for you. Perhaps it's a combination of people.
Layla, I heard you speak at a different event a couple of weeks ago. Not that I'm following you around the place, obviously, but I heard you say that somebody had a mentor and they refused to go for a coffee with them in a public place because they thought that people might think they were on a date.
Exactly.
Give us some more examples of that you think are like the real shocking ones that have come through your research.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that mentors is such an interesting question, because before I did the research, I did not know that LGBTQ plus people are less likely to have a mentor than other people. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. One of them is, as I mentioned, we tend to be a bit more self-sufficient, which makes us not that good at asking for help, or we might not think that we deserve help, or we might want a mentor who is a bit like us in terms of being LGBTQ plus, but actually there's fewer of them around and perhaps they're in quite high demand. But quite often, yeah, people will tell me that they ended up with a mentor who would actually be counterproductive. That example you gave is a really good one, where you're like, I don't want to be seen in public with you in case somebody thinks we're on a date. I mean, if that's somebody's anxiety levels, then they struggle perhaps to be supportive to you in other ways. People would describe mentors essentially finding out that they were gay and telling them, as you suggested there, tell you, well, maybe you should modify your voice, or maybe you should change your clothing, or address this mannerism, or when you're presenting, do it in this different way to essentially disguise the fact that you're an LGBTQ plus person. And that sort of stuff is just, it's really bad for us, because then we start to get into the way of trying to create another facade, even if we were out and we were trying to benefit from the good things that come from coming out at work. You're then creating a new facade where you're, having to worry and think about all these things, and somebody you really respect is telling you that that's what you need to do to succeed. Whereas we know that these things actually hold you back from performing as well as you possibly could. So I don't have a perfect answer for that, except to say, gosh, it's really interesting, isn't it, that we're less likely to have a mentor, even though it's well known that is really good for our careers. So we need to, if we end up with one of those mentors that's not necessarily got our best interests at heart, we need to maintain a bit of faith and you know, find a new one, and don't say, okay, well, I tried it and that wasn't for me, because actually, as I mentioned before about the self-censoring, there's all sorts of ways in which we end up holding ourselves back. And if we end up with somebody who happens to be homophobic, we shouldn't let that ruin our opportunity of having a mentor who could be really good for us. We should just, you know, onwards and upwards.
Mm-hmm. We've got another question about Section 28. Have you seen that there's been any difference between the people who grew up under Section 28, so the people who are in their 40s, say now, and people who didn't, people who are younger than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a huge thing, because Section 28 essentially stopped us from seeing our role models. It stopped us from reading about other people who were thriving in the world. It stops us from even knowing that as an LGBTQ plus person, you could essentially be all right, because that was information that was being actively suppressed, of course. And I was one of those people who grew up under Section 28, and I had never seen a real life LGBTQ plus person until I was like 18 or something. Really embarrassing. But all I mean, embarrassing, but also just like very, very isolating. And
Yeah, it does
it's
make you feel like you're the only one, doesn't it? You're so
Exactly.
weird that you're the
Exactly.
only person you've ever heard of.
And the only messaging you get is things that are negative. It has such a weird impact on how you think about yourself. And so I mean, I would say that at the time I was very anxious when I was a teenager about how I might get on in the world, because I'd only ever received negative messages about being LGBTQ plus until Ellen came out. And you know, that was one of the reasons that I studied to be a doctor, because I thought, well, honestly, it sounds like I'm going to be on my own in this world, and it's maybe not going to go well for me. So I need to make sure that I think of a career that is quite secure, a good vocational degree where, you know, there will be a clear job to go into with ideally a bit of shortages, so that I'll probably be okay despite being gay. And you know, it's such a weird thing to think about now, because now that I mean, in our staff groups, I'm sure many of you have staff groups, and you have these conversations and get to speak to people at a much earlier stage in their career who grew up after Section 28. Many of them reflect that it still had that impact, that people still felt uneasy about talking about being LGBTQ plus in schools many years after Section 28. My own mother's a teacher, and she remained anxious about talking to for the duration of her career. So I think that it has these long-lasting impacts, but I do think that many of the more junior people who joined the organization recently, just out of university, they describe being surprised about not being able to talk about this. But then some others spoke about having had this period where they felt fine about talking about it in school and university, and actually they came into the workplace and they felt they had to slightly go back into the closet, which is interesting as well. I asked pretty much all the people I interviewed, when you speak to younger people or more junior people in your staff groups or ERGs or wherever it may be, do they have different concerns than you did when you started work? And I actually, one of the most surprising things was how pretty much everyone said, nope, their concerns are not dissimilar to what they have ever been, which is, gosh, I'm quite anxious about coming out at work or being out at work, and how that affects perceptions of me and how that might affect my career. It's the top thing that people raise. And I think that is quite telling, because these are people who've grown up post Section 28, who have allegedly grown up in this, as people from my generation look at it and think, gosh, this must be some utopian thing. But actually, of course, that is not the case at all. And people continue to have these problems. At one point I thought, gosh, maybe my book's going to be irrelevant in like a couple of years, because the next generation is not having these issues. And then I found that some of them are having them worse than ever. And frankly, it's a confusing situation in terms of LGBTQ plus rights at the moment, and we don't quite know where things are going. So
It is. And just on that then, it feels to me like trans people are getting a particularly tough gig at the moment, particularly young people. So it feels a bit Section 2080 for them at the moment, but also for older trans people as well. Did you notice anything different in the research that you did? for those groups?
I mean, in most of those group, like for trans and non-binary people, they generally score lower in the staff surveys. Well, the score lower, so like they tend to get more bullying and harassment and discrimination. They get more sexual assault at work. They get more discrimination from their managers, and they are more likely to be discriminated against in application forms, so at the shortlisting process, and also during the interviews. So yeah, it definitely is the case, according to the data, that for the past many years, there has been that disparity. It's sort of why I call it the rainbow ceiling, because I think of it, it arches upwards. So you don't know where you're going to hit that ceiling. Perhaps if you're a man who is white, who happens to be gay, maybe your ceiling is there, but actually maybe if you're a person who is trans and black and has a disability, maybe it's a lot lower than that. So I think that it's quite clear that people have differences in how much being LGBTQ plus affects them, and there's all sorts of variables that feed into that. But I guess my point is that everybody is under that ceiling. It's just the height of the ceiling. And certainly there's a lot of reflection on how public discourse affects how people are treated in the public sphere when they're going about their lives, which in turn affects how they feel at work and how they're treated at work, and just generally the stress that they might be experiencing outside of work and the impact on their self-esteem and confidence can all come over into the workplace. And that's true for anybody who's experiencing harassment, discrimination, whether it's in healthcare or in a cafe or a hotel or at school or wherever that might be.
You described choosing the medical route because you were LGBT. Ali's just described going into the public sector because they were LGBT. In our survey, we actually directly asked the question: did you make these career choices, or to what extent was your career choices decided or determined through being LGBT? Another is where you live as well. A lot of people won't take a job somewhere that they perceive to be less LGBT friendly than other places. There's a big skew towards the big cities.
There's quite a lot of interesting stuff from my research when I interviewed a lot of ambassadors. I happen to have access to a lot of ambassadors because my wife was a diplomat at one point. So I had a little period of my life of being a diplomat's wife. So I interviewed all these ambassadors, and they said, it's funny, there's like whole regions where they've been climbing the ladder, and then they've sort of hit a ceiling because it's not necessarily the case that they're going to be able to be successful and supported in the most senior job in certain countries that they've been actually working towards getting to for their whole life. So there's this real challenge, I think, as we have these global careers, and we have opportunities to move around. We even have business trip opportunities, and probably our HR departments, our managers don't quite think enough about what the implications of being LGBTQ plus are in terms of inequalities in opportunity there.
We've got a question from George Layla. As a fresh entrepreneur, I'm curious to hear more about what can I do to be the better role model. I'm sure some of my employees are part of the LGBTQ community. How can I show them that they're accepted and well appreciated without being seen as prying or inappropriate?
Gosh, there's all sorts of good things you can do. And one of them is creating an ambience where people know that they're going to be supported. So, for example, in the book and in lots of different surveys and research, it shows that not that many LGBTQ plus people feel confident about telling their manager if they get any bullying or harassment, because they think that nothing will be done, and maybe in fact they'll even be punished in some way as a result of raising it. And so something that you can do is, if these things are raised, then take them seriously, properly deal with them as you would with any other reports of bullying or harassment or discrimination, so that people get the feeling that that this is going to be taken seriously. And then if you actually are interested in how LGBTQ plus people's experiences differ from other people's. Like quite often the questions asked in the staff survey, but then not everyone bothers to drill down and do that analysis. But, you know, there's the opportunity to split down your staff survey and just make comparisons. Where are the areas that your LGBTQ plus staff are having different experiences, and what are they? You can have a little focus group, have a discussion, figure that out. And then, of course, there's the challenge that some people will not disclose their sexual orientation or their gender identity on a staff survey. But that's about the ambience that you create in your organization, how comfortable people feel that if they do disclose that information, nothing bad will come as a result to them. Understand, like, find ways to just learn a bit more about our experiences and why we might have particular challenges and what these challenges might be, and how things differ, because we hear quite a lot about people saying, you know, we had diversity training, but it was a bit, you know, a bit light on the LGBTQ plus content, and it's referred to LGBTQ plus as one monolithic experience that people have, whereas obviously we know that with your lesbian or gay or bisexual or trans or non-binary or whatever your identity might happen to be, that you're having your own unique experience of that and understanding a bit more of that. Then there's like sort of practical things, like I mentioned the mentor thing. If you know that your LGBTQ plus colleagues are less likely to have mentors, like, can you like help them get one? Can you just like encourage people who are more likely to have imposter syndrome to look for and take opportunities when they come? And then, of course, if you're a person who's responsible for policies, there's all sorts of ways in which you can build a bit more equality into policies, whether it's things like parental leave or healthcare or dress codes. All these things can have an impact in helping people feel that they are included in the organization. And then I guess there's the question of you bring in all this diversity to your organization. You have these technically diverse staff, but then are you actually just expecting everybody to conform to like one culture and one way of doing things and one way of thinking about things? Because a lot of people reflect that they're told that the organization wants diversity, then you go in and actually they want the concept of somebody who can tick a diversity box, but they don't necessarily embrace the diversity of thinking that comes in, and the diversity of the ways that people do things. And if you are able to do that, then it can really, you know, build on the strengths and opportunities of diversity in an organization, and make people feel more valued and comfortable being themselves, whoever that may be at work.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. George, you're asking more questions. If you're happy to come onto camera and speak directly about your experience, I think that would be a useful thing to do. But if not, I understand. So George has said they've got a small team and they're extremely proud of them. I will take your advice. Thank you so much. I think part of it for me is you being out as well, you being out and open and demonstrating, just demonstrating that outness. It changes the culture.
Sorry to interrupt there. I was just going to say it's such a good point, because us being out is so important. But loads of people that I spoke to reflected that they thought that they were out. So they were out to their immediate teams. They didn't feel like they were hiding anything. But they hadn't really thought that if your organization is a little bit bigger, actually that might not, you know, resonate throughout the whole organization, and people might not be aware you're LGBTQ plus. It's quite unusual in those diversity characteristics that it is something that you sometimes have to explicitly say, and say repeatedly and publicly, if you want to get the benefits that come from being that visible role model. So people were reflecting, you know, that referring, you know, to their spouse and like in all staff meetings, and maybe writing things in blogs and all those sorts of things. Like, think of what's appropriate for your organization, obviously, but don't assume that people know that you're an LGBTQ plus person if you've got a little bit of a bigger organization, because the evidence is telling us that actually you have to just be a bit more vigorous than you thought you did if you want to reap the benefits of that. So yeah, something to think about.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because other people have said one of the barriers is that they have to keep coming out all the time. So, and the sort of pressure that puts on you as an individual, and yet to be a role model, you do kind of need to keep doing that.
It is true. I mean, it is an emotional burden for us to have to come out. And, this fallacy that people think you've come out and then, you're done. But I think that all of us in this room know that you come out again and again and again to, new people, you're some new starter, some new team member, whatever, some client, it just comes up and you have to come out. And every time you do, it's a little leap of faith, isn't it? It's a little bit of bravery that you have to have, because you know that it might be completely fine or uninteresting, or actually there might be a reaction that causes you a real problem. And I think that us being brave in that way shouldn't be underestimated as, something that we're contributing to the world, and trying to make things better for the people who find it even harder than us to say those words.
Yeah, absolutely. Layla, you've talked a bit there already in response to George's first question about the different things we can do as individuals. We are in a unique position, I would say, as Pride in Leadership, in that we exist to have this community that we've got here in front of us. Everybody here has some kind of role in some kind of organisation, probably at lots of different levels. What could we do as a community to come together to try and overcome these barriers and make a difference for ourselves and future generations of LGBT people?
I mean, a big part of it is being able to connect and communicate with each other, because we all have these experiences, and it's quite often the case that we sort of bear them alone, and we don't really think about we don't think about how others are having the same experiences, and we don't have access to those discussions. But being able to have those discussions with each other brings such a sense of support, and making it really clear that you're not on your own. This is a common thing, and here's how other people deal with it. And even so, there's the practical sort of coping mechanisms side of things, but then there's just also the moral and emotional support of knowing that other people have been in your situation and they understand you, and you know that they've been all right, and you will be too. I think that's probably the biggest thing that we can do for each other, is to be able to share that. It's why staff networks are so impactful. One of the many ways, obviously there's other reasons as well, but it's really significant to be able to find a peer group. And I don't know about you, I don't have a peer group. I mean, I run my staff network. I'm the executive sponsor, but that's a little bit different than being in your staff group, isn't it? And nobody else in my organization at executive level, as far as I know, is an LGBTQ plus person. So I think there's lots of people in that scenario where you're, you feel a little bit isolated. So using something like this to come together and have those conversations, I mean, it is powerful. And then of course, you can decide, are there particular things that you want to share resources to help each other in your organizations. And then there's the question of, are there things that you feel very strongly about that affect the teams that you're leading, that you want to speak out about in a more public way? I think there's lots of different opportunities to make really great use of this sort of opportunity. It's really nice that you've set this up and brought people together so that they can benefit from that.
That's really nice. I just to add to that, and it does go back a little bit to the Section 28 point that we've already covered, but I feel like the older you get, the more likely you are to be in a leadership role, or let me do it the other way around. Leaders tend to be a little bit older, just through the nature of getting through, the different rungs of the ladder. Often you bring your own experiences of being LGBT, and you bring your own experiences of coming out. For us, often it was through that time of Section 28. And I feel like sometimes one of the big things we can do is to continue to educate ourselves on what it's like now for people. I feel like the trans discussion at the moment is not something that is necessarily understood by older leaders. I feel like it sort of lends itself to younger people, and it means then that you could be an LGBT person in a leadership role and not actually supporting the LGBT people in your organization to the full extent that you could.
Well, yeah, and I think that's, I don't know why I'm suddenly being the massive advocate for staff networks, but I find that really helpful when we have those discussions. So, for example, we had a discussion recently about the word queer, and I had never used the word queer about myself for all sorts of reasons, in terms of prejudice, in terms of it being an insult in the past, in terms of it sounding like, I don't know, it was people who were a bit cooler than me and some, or younger than me, I don't know. But we had this conversation, and the younger members of the staff group who used that term as a matter of course, you know, made the case for it, and they changed my mind, and I started referring to myself as queer for the first time, and now I do that quite a lot. And I think, you know, I think that we all need to be constantly learning from each other, and we shouldn't assume that because we happen to be an LGBTQ plus person, we are the expert in all things LGBTQ plus. I mean, you see that, for example, I'm sure some of you have had the experience that your HR department will be like, oh, we need a new policy on this. Can you do it, gay person? And you're like, just because I happen to be gay, I don't know, you know, what all the right HR things to do. I'm not an HR person. I don't have those skills. I can have a look at it and tell you what I happen to think, but please don't consider me to be the expert in this particular topic where I don't have that expertise. And I think that people refer to that quite a lot. And you know, one of the things that people do recommend is if you want to get decent policies, like, if you don't have that expertise, seek the expertise, seek the advice and engage with your staff, but seek proper expertise if you want to do things right as well. And I think that is quite interesting. I feel like I went in all sorts of directions there, so I'll just stop.
No, it's good. Layla, you've got this book now. Obviously, you're being invited to talk to people like you're talking to us today. Who have you spoken to, and what's the next steps for you?
Yeah, it's been lovely. I've had the opportunity to speak to all sorts of people in terms of LGBTQ plus workplace type events, in terms of different organizations, staff networks, which has been lovely because I think there's such a nice opportunity to do things, you know, during Pride Month in particular, to open up the conversations, and they invite in people who wouldn't always hear about this. I think that what I'm really keen to do is make sure that, as well as LGBTQ plus people hearing about some of the lessons from this book, really making sure that the people just in general, anybody who's a manager or, you know, a good team member or somebody who's leading an organization, gets a bit more knowledge about this this whole topic that we've learned that quite often people lack knowledge on. And when you have knowledge, you have confidence, and you're able to do good things. So my ambition for this book is that it continues to reach people, both LGBTQ plus people, and really help us think about our careers properly, but also all those other people who affect our careers and think, gosh, what can I do to make life fairer? And that's what I'm going to be trying to do for the rest of the year.
Amazing. I love that. And you're really stepping into your power as well there, doing that.
But it's anxiety provoking, I think, for all of us. But you know, if you can do a thing, why not do it, is what I say.
Amazing. We've got a couple of final questions. One person, M, would like to know what it was that changed your mind specifically about using the word queer. It's quite controversial at the moment, queer, isn't it? Half it's a bit Marmite, half the people love it and half hate it.
There were lots of things, but I think one of the arguments that I liked was saying it's not my responsibility to tell you the very specific nature of my sexual orientation if I don't feel like doing that. I quite like this umbrella term that makes clear that you are within the LGBTQ plus community, but you don't feel like going into detail about it, and you don't have to, which I think is quite an interesting concept. It made me feel slightly more empowered as to what information I give to what people. Obviously, I'm now telling everybody in the world that I'm a lesbian, so it's a bit of a moot point, isn't it? And being, I guess, being inclusive of the wider community and feeling a part of that. But yeah, they had lots of thoughts like that I found interesting.
Yeah, lots of people here love queer. That's really good. Jamie's made a good point about trans inclusive policies that can be brought into the workplace. I'm going to follow up with Jamie afterwards and see if I can get hold of some. If anybody would like to something on that, send me an email and I'll see if there's something that we can share, because it feels that it's kind of an obvious thing that we should be sharing across our organisations. And I think we're coming to an end, Layla. Unless anybody's got any final questions for Layla, I will be letting you all go on time, which is amazing.
Well, it's been lovely speaking to you all. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, if some of you are particularly interested, then there's so much more detail in the book, but also in all sorts of interesting places, including, of course, with Pride in Leadership. So brilliant to have these resources that did not exist when I started my career.
Absolutely right. And thank you. And please, everybody, I'll send you all an email after this to tell you about the survey again and ask you to do that. Now you've got all the answers from Layla. I expect really comprehensive feedback from all of you. And yeah, Layla, thank you so much again. It was amazing. And I'm so pleased that you've written this book. I feel like you are a massive role model for all of us to step outside this gap of knowledge and just decide to fill it yourself. It's an amazing thing to have done. So thank you so much.
Lovely to see you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.